Good morning, everyone, and happy Easter. I hope you had a really, really nice break and that you found some time to relax and enjoy your family. I really hope everyone's dealing well as we just completed a month of being socially isolated. I don't know about you, but I'm finding it tiresome. I would like us to start getting back to um, you know, normal. But here we are, and it looks like we'll be doing this for the rest of the year. So I'm going to try to make this as painless and enjoyable an end of the year as possible for everybody. And the fact that we are beginning my favorite book to teach, Gatsby, hopefully will help make this exciting and enjoyable. I've never had a class yet that hasn't loved Gatsby, and I'm hoping that even though we're doing this remotely, you will enjoy it as much as all the other years have enjoyed it. So we're going to get started talking about Gatsby today. So this will be the first of the videos. I'm going to split it up. So this will be video number one. There will be another video that you will have to watch as well. Okay, so we're going to start. All right, we're going to start talking about the author. And then the second video, we're going to talk about the 1920s because we are beginning a new period of literature. So we've moved from, the early days of before the country became a country. Then we moved to, so that would be Enlightenment and the revolutionary period. Then we moved to Romanticism. Then we came out of Romanticism and into realism with a focus on regionalism. And now we're going into the period called modernism. And Gatsby is a quintessential example of American modernism period. And the author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, is a really interesting person in himself. And so we're going to spend a little time talking about him today. So please note first that we are dealing with 1896 to 1940 is when he lived. All right, so some important information to learn about him. So he is born in the Midwest, and that becomes a really important piece of information when we begin reading Gatsby, because the narrator of the story, Nick Carraway, is also from the Midwest, as are Daisy and Tom Buchanan. So the fact that they are Midwesterners and not native New Yorkers is going to be important to the story. And so was Fitzgerald. He is born in the Midwest in St. Paul, Minnesota. His family is not poor, but they're also, not particularly wealthy. And his mom was an Irish immigrant, and they lived on the outskirts of a wealthy neighborhood. So Fitzgerald would play with the children from the wealthier neighborhoods, but it's kind of the beginnings of this feeling that he was never really accepted in terms of the upper class people that he associated with. He began writing very early in his life in high school and won a couple literary awards in high school and wrote for the paper and things like that. And then he comes to the East Coast to attend Princeton University. So at the time, Princeton would be all men, right? And a obviously Ivy League wealthy school. So again, there's a lot of evidence that Fitzgerald felt like he never was truly accepted by the wealthy East Coast crowd that he hung out with at Princeton. There would have been a lot of New Yorkers who attended Princeton, a lot of family, generational, wealthy people who he would be associated with. And he never felt like he was accepted because he wasn't from that type of family, the East Coast old money types of families. He doesn't do particularly well at Princeton. He writes musicals, he writes for the paper, he takes a hand at some short stories. Um, but academically, he just kind of falls off the rails. And so he ends up dropping out of Princeton and he joins the Navy for a brief period of time. He did not see any action in terms of his military service. So you can't talk about Gatsby without talking about Zelda Fitzgerald. So you'll know as we go through the story that there are elements of Zelda throughout all of the female characters in the book. So while he's at Princeton, he falls in love with 18-year-old Zelda. And she is used to a pretty extravagant and affluent lifestyle. And he wants to marry her, but she refuses to marry him because he's not wealthy enough. She is used to a particular lifestyle, and he is not in a position to give her the type of lifestyle that she is accustomed to. And so she agrees to marry him at first and then breaks off the engagement because she just is worried that he's not going to be able to financially support her the way she wants to be. I'll let you decide what kind of woman that would make her. And then in 1920, he publishes his first novel, which is called This Side of Paradise. And it is a big success, and he makes a lot of money off it, and she agrees to marry him. So they do eventually get married after the success of This Side of Paradise. A year later, they have their only child. They only ever have one child. It's a daughter. They name her Frances Scott Fitzgerald, but the female spelling of Frances, and they call her Scotty. So that's the only child they have. It is a tumultuous relationship, to say the least. Zelda had a lot of problems. Fitzgerald had his own problems, mainly, stemming from alcohol. But Zelda actually has, significant mental health issues at a time when no one really understood mental health issues. And she suffers, beginning in 1930, a series of serious mental breakdowns, which ultimately result in her being institutionalized in 1934, and she remains institutionalized until her death. Fitzgerald never divorces her. He remains married to her, even though she's institutionalized, but he does have a long-term, about a 10-year relationship with a journalist, and until his death in 1940. But you need to know this information about Zelda because it's important to see where he puts elements of her into Gatsby. A lot of people are like, "Oh, Zelda's Daisy." Not really. I think Zelda is a combination of Myrtle, of Daisy, of Jordan. She's a combination. There's a little bit of Zelda in all of the major female characters in the story. Rather tragic relationship in the end. All right, what else do we need to know? All right, so F. Scott and Zelda settle in New York City, and they are what we would consider today the it couple. They are the Beyonce, Jay-Z. They are, Kim Kardashian and Kanye. They are people who would be, in today's world, influencers, I guess. Everything they did was followed. So Zelda would cut her hair, and then all of the women would want this Zelda hairstyle. So she would dictate the fashion trends. She would dictate the clothing fashion trends. So if she wore a particular outfit, there'd be knockoffs of it, in small town stores all across the United States. People would want to dress and look like Zelda. They would throw extravagant, wild parties. They spent money like it was water, and it was money they didn't have. They lived well, well, well beyond their means. which isn't surprising given how they got together, right? But they, while it was good, it was really, really good. But it centered on heavy, heavy alcohol consumption. And today, you'd probably want to stage an intervention, right? Because it was definitely bordering on alcoholism. And F. Scott Fitzgerald clearly had a drinking problem. And so, a lot of their parties were the basis of their parties was drinking alcohol. Um, they spent a great deal of their time split between New York and Europe, and they spent large chunks of time in Europe. Partly because of the debts that they had, right? They were constantly being hounded by creditors, but also because of prohibition. And we're going to talk about that in the next video. But prohibition is the amendment to the Constitution that forbid alcohol consumption, and so prohibition drove them to Europe. There was no prohibition in Europe, and so for people who liked to drink, Europe was if you were wealthy enough, Europe was an option, and so they went and lived in Paris for parts of their time. Parts of their marriage. And Fitzgerald is definitely part of the lost generation of writers that expatriates that lived in Europe during the 20s. And we'll talk about that also a little more in detail in the next video. But they definitely spent their time split between New York and Europe. He dies in 1940. And in some ways, it's a rather sad, tragic death because he, is basically dies in literary oblivion, meaning no one was really paying any attention to him. None of the books that he wrote later after Gatsby had the success that he saw with Gatsby. So he had This Side of Paradise, and then he also wrote The Beautiful and the Damned, Tender is the Night, and The Last Tycoon are his novels. He wrote many, many short stories, and they're all considered, examples of the modernist movement. All right, so let's talk specifically here about Gatsby a little bit, some of the things you need to consider. The first is the date, please. The date is 1925. That's the date it's published, 1925. It is his most famous work. Obviously, everyone knows Gatsby, right? I bet none of you know the Beautiful and the Damned, but everybody seems to, know Gatsby. It helps that, multiple movie versions of it are floated around out there. So why is it so famous? Why is it so beloved? Well, because it captures post-war America in a way that other novels tried but didn't really succeed. It is a snapshot of a time period in America that is unique and hasn't been duplicated. Why is it so admired in literary circles? One of the primary reasons is its tone. You'll see it is very formal writing. It's easy to read in that it's an easy story to follow. You're not going to have any trouble, thinking about the characters and following the story and what's going on. It is difficult because in some ways it has the intensity of a poem. And what I mean by that is he has prolific, meaning great use of imagery. And so a lot of the way that he writes, it almost feels like you're reading poetry. It is not rhyme. It is not meter. It doesn't have the elements of poetry, except that the wording is so filled with imagery and painting of a picture that it almost feels at times like you're reading a poem. And he was largely influenced by his surrounding and his own experiences. But I want you to understand this, please, and I have to make it clear, this is not an autobiographic book. It is not his life. It is a fictional story about made-up fictional people in a made-up fictional towns that have elements of Fitzgerald's life, that have elements of what was occurring in New York City, has elements of real life in it, which makes it seem like it's real. All right. So please remember that it is not his own. He's not writing this as this is what happened to me. If you think that, then you're going to be led down the wrong path. You absolutely have to understand, while he put some of his own experiences into the story, there you will see elements that seem familiar to his own background. It is not an autobiographical story. All right, so you need to understand when the story is occurring. It is the summer of 1922. That's the setting, summer of 1922, and it takes place on the outskirts of New York City and in New York City. So you have to pay attention to where the characters are and what they're doing. But it's all basically the summer of 1922 that the story takes place. What kinds of details does Fitzgerald use to get across his themes? You must pay attention to geography. Excuse me. He uses geography as an important motif, recurring idea that helps to convey theme, particularly one of social class division. So where characters live, where they are, versus where they travel to. How does their behavior change when they are in one place versus another place? Geography is a recurring motif that helps to convey thematic ideas. Okay, so we're going to take a look at those very closely as in the opening exposition chapters. He uses weather very often to reflect human condition, something writers do a lot, right? So, when it's raining, what might that suggest about what's going on with the characters? When it's sunny, when it's hot. So you need to connect the weather conditions to the human conditions. His prolific use of colors, right? When we talk about the use of imagery, almost like poetry, he uses colors as symbols. So it's in a book that's largely about the American dream. It is no coincidence that red, white, and blue are recurring colors. Of course, green is going to be a very significant color as well. And you need to be looking for where you see these colors coming up, right? Where you can start tracking colors through the chapters and see how he is using them repeatedly in order to help convey theme. The other major issue with regards to Gatsby is the vocabulary is very, very, very elevated. You are going to have to look up words. Listen to me when I tell you, you are going to have to look up words, okay? There are going to be words that are very, very unusual in terms of they're, ones we don't use in everyday speech. So you're going to have to look them up in order to understand what he's talking about. He writes in very long sentences, compound, complex sentences. He wants you to feel like you're reading poetry at times, which makes sometimes it difficult to determine what's actually going on in the sentences. So what kinds of major themes? These are the major themes. There are obviously others, but these are the three major themes that we are going to be taking a look at. The first is the death of the American dream, right? So remember, I've said it often over the course of this year, war messes people up, right? So when you had the Civil War, which impacted the works that were coming out in the United States in the late 1800s, World War I is, of course, going to impact the world after it. So World War I takes place 1914 to 1917. And so, it was the largest loss of life up to that date and impacted the world tremendously. And so this concept of America and what it means to be successful in America, what it means to be happy in America, Fitzgerald's really questioning that. He's really calling into doubt the reality of the American dream, or at least he's suggesting that the American dream has shifted and that we need to think more clearly about what it means to be happy. He is also making some serious suggestions and ideas about social class separation. In terms of talking about how he believed he was never really accepted by the East Coast society because he wasn't born here, wasn't from old money. The idea that there were super wealthy old money, new money, no money, um, very clear distinctions after the war. That is a very clear theme that he is addressing in Gatsby. And then he's also talking about that the Roaring Twenties saw a change, and to Fitzgerald, what he would consider a loss of morals and integrity. And that goes hand in hand with the other two thematic ideas. In pursuit of wealth, do we give up our morals and integrity in order to, because we believe that's what it means to be successful and happy? So, where is God in a post-war America? Um, it's easy to think that you are moralistic if you have a lot of money, right? Because you don't have to deal with the struggles of every day, and get rich quick. How did that impact people's morals and integrity? So, you hear a little bit of Twain in there for sure, but these are the three main thematic ideas that we will be looking at in Gatsby. So why do we read it? Well, because, like I said, it is a snapshot of the 1920s in post World War One America, pre Great Depression. Right, the Great Depression's on the horizon. And the 1920s were a profound political, social, and economic changes in America. That's a period of such great change that forever changes the face of America. And Fitzgerald was able to capture that in this novel. Um, yes, it's a fictional story, but it is so informed by reality that we really get a glimpse into a complicated and fascinating time in America. And while it has its faults, it also has some things that are intriguing and fascinating. The parties, the wealth, the social norms that were becoming acceptable, and how that all worked together to create this, dynamic of the Roaring Twenties. And then, obviously, we read things because there's some lasting ideas that are still applicable no matter the time period, particularly as it pertains to the American dream and class distinction. If you think way back to the beginning of the year when I asked you to consider what the American dream was, and you did all the research, reading and looking at songs and reading articles about the American dream, well, and what that means today, we are still questioning it. We are still wondering if it's valid. We are still fixated on the ideas of class distinctions and a classless, supposedly classless America. And so some of the questions that Fitzgerald raises in Gatsby through the themes are absolutely applicable today. And that's what we're going to be talking about as we go through this book. All right, so that's a lot of information on Fitzgerald and some really important information about the novel itself. The next PowerPoint, we're going to talk more specifically about the setting because, like I said, you have to have some concept of what's going on in the 20s in order to understand the novel. So that's where we're headed next. I will post this PowerPoint separately so that you can go back and take a look at it separately from this lecture. Okay, see you in a bit.